"People like you do not belong in my building," Preston Whitmore said, loud enough for the security guard, the receptionist, the junior property manager, and 3 men in suits waiting near the brass elevators to hear. Julian Carter stood in the lobby of Whitmore Exchange Building with one hand on the handle of a rolling computer crate. He wore a simple black jacket, dark jeans, and work boots with dust on the sides from the loading dock. No driver waited outside. No assistant stood beside him. No gold watch flashed on his wrist. A cardboard box of network switches sat at his feet, marked Carter Grid Future Lab in blue tape. The marble floor beneath him was old and polished so brightly it reflected the cold chandelier light above. On the reception desk, his access card lay where Preston had thrown it. The plastic hit the stone counter with a small, flat sound. Everyone heard it. Maya Ellis, the assistant building manager, went pale.
Samuel Reed, the older security guard, lowered his eyes because he had heard Preston speak that way before. The receptionist stopped typing. Even the elevator seemed to hold its breath before the brass doors closed. Julian looked at Preston for a long moment. Then he asked, "Are you sure this is still your building?" Preston laughed. "I am the landlord. I decide who gets in." Within 3 hours, Preston Whitmore would watch that same access system taken out of his hands. Within 3 hours, his operating accounts would be frozen under a cash control agreement he had ignored. Within 3 hours, tenants would be told to stop paying rent to him directly. And within 3 hours, the man he had locked out would activate the commercial foreclosure file on the very building Preston had inherited and believed no one could take from him. But in that lobby, at 8:16 in the morning, Preston still thought he was humiliating a tenant with no power. That was the mistake. Whitmore Exchange Building stood on Walnut Street in downtown Philadelphia. 14 stories of old money dressed as architecture. Its lobby had black marble walls, brass elevator doors, dark wood panels, and a directory listing law firms, tax consultants, investment offices, and 2 private wealth advisors who paid extra to have their company names engraved in larger letters. The building had once meant something. Preston loved telling people that. "My grandfather bought it when men still did business face to face," he would say. But buildings can look proud while rotting behind the walls. The west elevator stalled twice a week. The heating system coughed in winter and rattled in summer. Fire inspection corrections from 6 months earlier remained open. Maintenance fees collected from tenants disappeared into vague operating accounts. Smaller businesses were charged late fees even when their rent was received on time. Complaints from immigrant-owned tenants were marked difficult. Requests from large financial tenants were marked priority. Preston called that standards. Maya called it fear, but only in her head. She had worked for Preston for 2 years and learned that the easiest way to keep her job was to say less than she knew. She knew the 18th floor lease had been signed. She had processed the deposit. She had logged the move-in date. She had created the access profile for Carter Grid Future Lab the night before at 7:42. She had also seen the alert on the loan portal. Commercial debt transfer recorded. Loan file WEB 1792. New noteholder representative, Carter Grid Capital Holdings. The name had made her stop. Carter Grid. The same name on the new tenant lease. She had tried to ask Preston if he had read the notice. He had waved her away. "Another bank letter," he said. "They always send paper when they want attention." Now Julian Carter stood in the lobby, and Preston had still not read the paper. Julian arrived through the side entrance at 8:04 because he did not want photographers, donors, or staff to see him carrying equipment and turn the morning into a ceremony. The first Carter Grid Future Lab orientation would not begin until 2 that afternoon. Nina Thompson, who ran the community nonprofit partnering with his company, would arrive at 11 with volunteers, folding tables, and the first group of students. Julian wanted to inspect the space alone first. He wanted to see whether the wiring was ready, whether the elevator access worked, whether the door locks opened smoothly, whether the building staff treated an ordinary man carrying boxes as someone with a right to be there. That last part mattered most. The future lab was not supposed to be beautiful. It was supposed to be useful. Free coding classes, data analytics training, interview coaching, refurbished laptops, evening sessions for laid-off warehouse workers and young people who had never been invited into a room where technology sounded like a future instead of a locked gate. Julian knew what a locked gate felt like. His father had carried keys for buildings he did not own. Frank Carter had worked maintenance in office towers from the time Julian was 6. He fixed air vents for lawyers who never learned his name. He replaced bulbs above conference tables where men discussed millions and stepped around the ladder without saying thank you. He unclogged sinks in executive washrooms and was told to use the service elevator because clients should not see tools in the main lobby. One afternoon, when Julian was 12, a landlord accused Frank of losing a master key ring. They searched his toolbox in front of 2 tenants. The keys were later found inside the management office beneath a stack of lease files. No real apology came, only a shrug.
Frank had walked home with Julian that evening and said, "Son, some people think owning a building means they own the dignity of everyone who walks through it. Never become that kind of man." Julian had not forgotten. Years later, after building Carter Grid Technologies from a server repair business into a cloud infrastructure company with contracts across 4 states, he still inspected properties the same way, through doors, through staff, through silence. At 8:06, he signed in at the desk. Samuel Reed was on security duty. He was 63, with silver hair at the temples and a navy blazer that had been pressed too many times. His badge read, Samuel Reed, Security. He had worked Whitmore Exchange for 11 years, long enough to know which tenants Preston greeted by name and which visitors Preston watched like stains on the marble. "Good morning," Samuel said. "Delivery entrance is around the back if you need freight access." Julian smiled. "Thank you. I am actually going to the 18th floor." Samuel checked the tablet. Name: Julian Carter. Samuel typed it in. The screen loaded slowly, then the profile appeared. Carter Grid Future Lab, tenant access, floor 18, move-in approved. Samuel looked up. "Yes, sir, you are in the system." Julian noticed the sir. Not forced, natural. He appreciated it. Maya came from the side office holding a stack of access cards and a folder labeled 18th Floor Tenant Onboarding. When she saw Julian, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Not from meeting him, from paperwork. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully. "Yes?" "I am Maya Ellis. I handled your move-in file. Thank you for getting it done quickly." Her eyes moved toward Preston's office. "You should have full access, but there may be a delay with the main elevator permissions. I can come up with you to verify." Before Julian could answer, Preston Whitmore stepped out of the private landlord office with a porcelain coffee cup in one hand. Preston was 54, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a gray suit that looked expensive in the way inherited men often dressed, as if tailoring could replace work. His family name was carved into the stone above the building entrance. He believed that made him part of the structure. His eyes went to Julian, then to the box, then to the rolling crate. "Who are you delivering for?" The question was not rude by itself. The tone was. Julian turned. "I am Julian Carter. I lease the 18th floor." Preston smiled as though humoring a child. "No, the 18th floor is a premium commercial space." Maya stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, Carter Grid Future Lab has a signed lease for the full floor." Preston did not look at her. He looked at Julian Boots. A training charity thing, right? Julian said, "A technology training center." Preston lifted one eyebrow. For whom? For people building new careers. Preston glanced toward the men in suits by the elevator. This is not a community center.
Julian remained calm. It is a leased office floor.
Preston set his coffee on the desk. Let me see the lease. Julian opened his satchel and removed a copy. Preston took it with 2 fingers, flipped the first page, then stopped before reading the signature block. Maya watched him miss the part that mattered. Tenant, Carter Grid Future Lab. Guarantor, Carter Grid Technologies. Authorized signatory, Julian Carter. Preston handed the document back. This is not going to work. Julian looked at him. On what basis? Fit. The word sat there. Fit. Maya looked down. Samuel stopped typing. Julian folded the lease neatly. Fit is not a clause. Preston's face tightened. This building serves serious firms, and we are serious. You are rolling computer parts through my lobby. Julian looked at the crate. Yes, because computers are part of a computer lab. One of the men in suits near the elevator chuckled. Preston liked that. He pointed toward the side door.
Use the freight entrance and wait until we confirm your paperwork.
Maya spoke quickly. His paperwork is confirmed. Preston turned to her. Maya, do not correct me in my lobby. She went still. That was how he worked. One sentence, and everyone remembered rent, schedules, references, paychecks. Julian saw it. He had seen enough buildings to know when employees had learned to make themselves smaller. He lifted the crate handle. I will go upstairs, inspect the space, and be out of your way. Preston stepped closer. You will wait. Julian looked at the brass elevator doors. No. The lobby tightened. Preston seemed almost offended that the word had been spoken to him. No. Julian's voice was steady. I have a signed lease, paid deposit, move-in confirmation, and access profile. Unless you have a legal notice terminating entry rights, I am going to the 18th floor. Preston's eyes cooled. Maya? She did not answer. Preston turned toward Samuel. Disable his card. Samuel looked up. Sir? Disable it.
Samuel hesitated. We need a written reason for access removal on a current tenant. Preston leaned over the desk. Then write tenant access under review.
Maya said, Mr. Whitmore, we cannot lock out a tenant without notice. Preston did not even turn around. Watch me. Julian looked toward the ceiling. A security camera watched the desk. Red light blinking. Recording. That mattered. He said nothing. Samuel's hands hovered over the keyboard. He did not want to do it. Preston saw the hesitation and lowered his voice. Samuel, I do not pay you to interpret law. Samuel's jaw tightened. He clicked the access screen. Card status. Suspended. The light beside Julian's name turned red. Julian felt something old move inside him. Not anger first. Memory. His father standing beside a toolbox while a landlord treated suspicion like authority. His mother telling Frank at the kitchen table that silence was sometimes survival, but never justice. Julian looked at Samuel. I understand. Samuel's eyes lifted.
The older man knew what that meant. It was not forgiveness.
It was recognition. Preston picked up the access card and tossed it onto the desk in front of Julian. Then he said the line that would undo him. People like you do not belong in my building. A breath vanished from the room. Maya's face went white. Samuel closed his eyes.
The receptionist stopped typing. Julian did not move. He looked at Preston carefully, like a man reading a contract line that had just become active. "What do you mean by people like me?" Preston gave a thin smile. "People who do not understand where they are." Julian nodded once. "Then we are no longer discussing a move-in delay." Preston scoffed. "What are we discussing?" "Governance risk to collateral." Preston laughed because he did not understand the danger in the words. Collateral. "This is my building." Julian picked up the access card from the desk and placed it in his satchel. "Are you sure?" Preston leaned closer. "I inherited this building from my father."
My name is on the deed. My name is on the door. My office is upstairs. And I decide who belongs here. Julian looked at Maya. Please preserve the access log. Preston snapped. She works for me. Julian said, not if your control changes today. The lobby went silent. Preston stared. Control. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket and called Elaine Brooks. She answered on the second ring. Did the walkthrough start? Julian looked at the locked card reader glowing red beside the elevator. It became an enforcement event. Elaine's voice changed. What happened? Illegal lockout of assigned tenant, access disabled, equipment held upstairs, witnesses present, discriminatory statement in the lobby, potential instruction to security to create a false access justification. Preston folded his arms and smirked. Julian continued. Activate Whitmore file, full enforcement package.
Bring the note purchase assignment, default notice, cash management control agreement, receiver motion draft, tenant direction letters, and the building operations transfer protocol. Elaine was quiet for one beat. Then she said, clean execution. Clean, Julian said. No emotion, only contract. Preston laughed loudly enough for the lobby to hear. You are calling a lawyer to get into my building. Julian ended the call and looked at him. No. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. I am calling a lawyer to decide how much longer it remains yours to control. For the first time, Preston did not laugh immediately. Maya heard the difference. So did Samuel. Julian picked up the rolling crate handle, moved it gently beside the wall, and sat on the edge of a lobby bench beneath the directory of tenant names. Preston stared at him. What are you doing? Waiting. For what? For you to realize which door you locked. Preston turned away in disgust. Maya watched Julian sit there, calm, steady, not defeated. She looked at the access log still open on Samuel's screen. Card suspended, reason field blank. Her hands moved before fear could stop them. She took out her phone and photographed the screen. Samuel saw her. He did not stop her. Above them, the old chandelier hummed faintly. Outside, morning traffic moved through downtown Philadelphia. Inside Whitmore Exchange Building, Preston Whitmore still believed power lived in a deed, a family name, and a locked door. Julian Carter knew better. Power was already on its way in a black legal folder, and the lock Preston had just turned was about to open every file he had spent years keeping closed. Julian Carter sat on the lobby bench beneath the tenant directory and waited. That was the part Preston did not understand. Waiting was not weakness. Waiting was discipline. The rolling computer crate stood beside Julian's knees. The cardboard box of network switches sat on the marble floor near his boots. Above him, the directory listed firms that sounded expensive. Whitmore Legal Advisors, Brantley Capital, Old Dominion Tax Partners, Fairchild Private Wealth. Near the bottom, in smaller letters that had been added only the day before, one new line appeared. Carter Grid Future Lab, Floor 18. Preston had not noticed the name when it mattered. Now the name was staring at him from the wall. Julian looked at it for a long moment. Future Lab. That was the reason he had come early. Not for a ribbon cutting. Not for photographs. Not for applause from donors. He had come because rooms reveal themselves before crowds arrive. A classroom can be polished and still be hostile. A building can have brass elevators and still teach certain people to lower their eyes. A lease can say access granted, but a lobby can still decide who it wants to believe belongs. Julian knew that before he ever became Chief Executive Officer of Carter Grid Technologies. He knew it from watching his father carry tools through side doors. Frank Carter had fixed the hidden parts of beautiful buildings. He knew where the pipes sweated in summer. He knew which elevators groaned before they stalled. He knew which executive bathrooms had leaking valves, which conference rooms had bad wiring, and which landlords smiled at tenants while delaying repairs for the people who cleaned after them. Frank always said buildings told the truth in places rich people did not look. Basements, service corridors, maintenance closets, security desks. Julian learned to listen there. When he was 12, he followed his father to a downtown office tower on a Saturday. Frank had been called to replace a faulty lock on a storage room. Julian remembered the smell of dust, metal, and old coffee. He remembered the sound of his father's keys on the ring. He remembered a landlord in a pinstripe suit accusing Frank of losing the master set after one tenant could not find a key. Frank opened his toolbox in the lobby, in front of everyone. Screwdrivers, wire cutters, a roll of electrical tape, a flashlight. No keys. The missing key ring was later found in the management office under a stack of lease files. The landlord said, "All right then, not sorry, not I was wrong, just all right." That night, Frank walked home with Julian because he said the bus was too crowded for anger. When they reached their apartment, he sat on the stairs and took a long breath. Then he said, "Son, some people think owning a building means they own the dignity of everyone who walks through it. Never become that kind of man." Julian did not. He became a man who built systems. First, he repaired servers in cramped closets where companies forgot the machines until they failed. Then he built secure networks for hospitals that could not afford downtime. Then he founded Carter Grid Technologies, a company that designed cloud infrastructure, artificial intelligence workflow tools, and data platforms for businesses that needed more than buzzwords. By 43, he employed 600 people and had offices in 4 states. But he still remembered which rooms made him feel unwelcome. That was why Future Lab mattered. It was not charity for a press release. It was debt paid forward. The students arriving that afternoon were not polished college interns from famous schools. They were laid-off warehouse workers, restaurant staff learning data tools at night, young people from neighborhoods where talent grew up faster than opportunity, single parents who could not afford boot camps, veterans trying to rebuild a career after years of being told they were too old to learn new systems. Nina Thompson had helped build the program. Nina ran Bridgepath Community Works from a narrow office near the train station. She knew every kind of applicant people overlooked. The mother who could fix any spreadsheet but had no degree. The teenager who built computers from discarded parts. The former factory line supervisor who understood process better than most managers but did not know the word analytics. When Nina toured the 18th floor with Julian 2 weeks earlier, she had stood near the windows and said, "This room is too nice for people who have been told no all their lives." Julian had answered, "Then it is exactly right." He had signed the lease the next day, but he had signed more than that. He had already moved quietly to secure the building itself, because before Carter Grid Future Lab signed the lease, Elaine Brooks had found the truth under Whitmore Exchange Building. Loan file WEB 1792. Original principal balance, $28 million. Maturity default, 3 months past due. Debt service coverage breach. Occupancy covenant breach. Deferred maintenance reserves depleted. Tenant improvement escrow misused. Fire safety correction reports pending. Rent roll inconsistencies. The loan had been sold from the original bank into a distressed commercial debt pool after Preston failed to cure the default. Most buyers looked at Whitmore Exchange and saw an old building with weak occupancy and a difficult owner. Julian saw something else, a building near transit, a floor perfect for training labs, small tenants who needed stability, a landlord who could ruin the project if nobody held him accountable. So Carter Grid Capital Holdings, a finance affiliate tied to Julian Company, acquired the note through a lawful assignment. Elaine drafted the control strategy carefully. They did not intend to foreclose immediately. They intended to stabilize the asset, protect the future lab lease, and give Preston one final chance to operate responsibly under oversight. If he complied, the building could recover. If he did not, the documents were ready. Notice of default, assignment of note, cash management control agreement, emergency receiver motion draft, tenant direction letters, preservation notice, operations transfer protocol. Everything clean, everything lawful, everything waiting. Julian did not want to use it. That was what Preston would never understand. Real power does not always want the moment it becomes necessary. In the lobby, the clock above reception clicked to 8:29. Preston paced near the front desk, pretending Julian did not matter, while watching him from the corner of his eye. He hated that Julian remained calm. He hated that Julian had not yelled, had not begged, had not rushed to prove his importance. Preston preferred people who reacted. Reaction gave him something to punish. Maya Ellis stood near the side office with her phone in one hand. Her thumb hovered over the photograph she had taken of the access log. Card suspended. Reason field blank. She knew she should send it to herself. She knew she should preserve the record somewhere Preston could not delete it. She also knew Preston could destroy her job before noon. Her mother lived with her. Her younger brother needed help with tuition. Maya had a lease, car payments, medical bills. Courage was easier in movies than it was when rent came due on the 1st. Still, she looked at Julian on the bench. He was the one locked out. Yet somehow she felt like he had opened a door inside her. Samuel Reed leaned over the security desk and lowered his voice. Maya. She looked up. Send it. Her heart jumped. Preston will know. Samuel glanced toward Preston. He already knows what he told us to do. Maya looked at Samuel. The older guard voice stayed quiet. I have let too many things become normal in this lobby. That sentence nearly broke her. Samuel had seen Preston tell delivery drivers to use backhauls even when they carried legal documents. He had seen him ask black business owners for extra identification after their names were already approved. He had watched him call immigrant tenants difficult when they asked why maintenance fees rose while the heating failed. Samuel had told himself he was security, not management. But a man can stand beside a locked door long enough to become part of the lock. He did not want that anymore. Maya sent the photo to her personal email, then created a note. 8:17 in the morning. Preston Whitmore ordered access suspension for Carter Grid Future Lab tenant. No written notice, no default, no legal basis provided. Witnesses present, statement made in lobby. Her hand shook while typing, then she saved it. Preston turned suddenly. What are you doing? Maya lowered the phone, documenting the access issue. His eyes narrowed. For internal record. He walked toward her. There is no issue. There is an unauthorized person attempting to occupy premium space under questionable paperwork. Julian stood from the bench. The paperwork is signed. Preston did not look at him. Maya, pull the lease file. She opened the folder on the desk. Here. Preston snatched it and flipped through pages quickly, not reading, only searching for something that would rescue his decision. Julian watched. Page 1, premises. Page 2, term. Page 3, deposit. Page 4, access rights. Page 5, building services. Page 6, quiet enjoyment. Preston stopped there. The words should have warned him. Quiet enjoyment. The tenant right to use the leased premises without unlawful interference by the landlord. Preston read one line, then closed the folder. This lease is subject to building rules. Julian said, building rules do not override the lease. They do when I enforce standards. Julian looked at him. Standards are not whatever you feel when you look at a person. Preston's face hardened. Careful. Julian nodded. You should be. Samuel looked down to hide the smallest change in his expression. Preston turned toward him. Do not stand there smiling. Samuel was not smiling. Yes, sir. Preston pointed at the computer. Add the reason for suspension. Samuel hesitated. What reason? Preston's eyes sharpened. Tenant attempted unauthorized move-in with unapproved equipment and disruptive conduct. Maya stared. That is not accurate. Preston turned slowly. Excuse me? Maya's voice weakened but did not vanish. The move-in was approved. The equipment list was submitted yesterday. There was no disruptive conduct. Preston stepped close enough that she could smell his coffee. Maya, do you want to keep working here? The lobby went still. Julian saw the threat land. Not only on Maya, on Samuel, on the receptionist, on every person in the room who had ever chosen silence because Preston held schedules, references, paychecks, access codes, and the small levers of daily survival. Julian picked up his phone. Preston looked at him. Calling your lawyer again? No. Julian raised the phone slightly, screen facing outward. Recording the instruction you just gave your staff to create a false reason after the lockout. Preston froze. The men in suits near the elevator looked over. Maya covered her mouth. Samuel straightened. Preston said, You cannot record me in my building. Julian said, You are in a public lobby with security cameras recording every angle. And you are discussing access to my leased premises. Preston stepped closer. Delete it. No, delete it now. Julian held his gaze. You keep treating paper like decoration and law like tone. That is why we are here. Preston reached as if to grab the phone. Samuel moved before anyone expected him to. He stepped between them. Sir, do not touch him. Preston stared at Samuel. What did you say? Samuel's voice shook, but he repeated it. Do not touch him. The lobby held its breath. For 11 years, Samuel had said yes, sir, to Preston Whitmore. Now he had said stop. Julian looked at Samuel back. A man becomes taller the first time he refuses a bad order. Preston could feel the room shifting and hated it. He pointed toward the elevators. Fine. If he claims the 18th floor is his, take him up. Let him see it locked. Maya said, Sir, please do not do this. Preston snapped. I want him to understand where he stands. Julian said, I know where I stand. Preston smiled. Good. Then come see the door. They rode the elevator in a silence so tight even the brass walls seemed to listen. Julian stood with the computer crate. Preston stood beside the control panel. Maya stood behind him, clutching the lease folder. Samuel stood near the door, hands folded, eyes straight ahead. The elevator climbed. 10, 11, 12. The numbers lit one by one. Julian remembered riding elevators with his father. Service elevators mostly. Freight cars that smelled like dust and old carpet. Frank would let him press the button when nobody else was inside. Top floor, son, he would say. Even if we are only fixing pipes, your finger can still choose the top floor. At 18, the doors opened. The hallway was freshly painted. Carter Grid Future Lab signs had not yet been installed, but several boxes sat inside the glass entry beyond the locked door. Through the glass, Julian could see the space. Rows of folding tables, refurbished laptops still in shipping cartons, 2 small server racks, a whiteboard leaning against the wall, a banner rolled in plastic. Carter Grid Future Lab. Everyone belongs in the room where they can build. Julian looked at the banner longer than he meant to. Preston noticed. Touching, he said. Julian did not answer. Preston walked to the glass door and pointed at the temporary chain lock installed across the handles. I had maintenance secure it. Maya gasped. You installed a secondary lock? Preston said, until this is resolved. Julian looked at the lock. When? Preston smiled. After you came in. Samuel whispered, Lord. Preston turned. Problem. Samuel looked at the chain. That is not standard. Preston said, It is now. Maya looked at Julian. I did not authorize that. The work order was not in the system. Julian took one photograph, then another. Chain lock, door handles, equipment visible inside, hall camera above the elevator, timestamp on his phone. Preston said, "Take all the pictures you want." Julian lowered the phone. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making the interference visible." Preston laughed. "This is my property. I can secure any floor I choose." Julian looked at the camera above them. "You can secure vacant space. You cannot lock a paid tenant out, hold tenant equipment inside, disable access without notice, and fabricate a violation after the fact." Preston's voice dropped. "Listen carefully. People like you do not get to walk into a building like this, drag in a few boxes, and tell me what I can do." Maya whispered, "Mr. Whitmore." He ignored her. Julian stepped closer to the glass and looked at the computers inside. For a brief second, he almost felt tired. Not defeated, tired. Tired of doors that only opened after credentials. Tired of men who mistook inherited control for earned authority. Tired of needing documents to prove what should have been simple. A tenant with a lease belongs in the leased space. A person with a name deserves to be called by it. A classroom for people climbing toward better work should not have to beg past a landlord afraid of who might come through the lobby. Then Frank Carter's voice returned. "Never become that kind of man." Julian straightened. He turned from the locked door. Preston saw him stand taller and frowned. Julian said, "I was going to give you a chance to cure the default under supervision." Preston blinked. "What default?" Julian looked at him. "The loan." Maya closed her eyes. Samuel looked from Julian to Preston. Preston scoffed. "You do not know anything about my loan. I know the maturity default. I know the failed forbearance conditions. I know the rent roll discrepancies. I know the maintenance reserve issue. I know the fire inspection corrections. I know the cash management trigger. And I know the notice of assignment you ignored last week." The hallway went silent. Preston's smile disappeared. Julian continued. "I also know your conduct this morning has created a new operational risk event." Preston stared. "Who are you?" Julian did not answer immediately. The elevator chimed behind them. The doors opened. Elaine Brooks stepped out in a navy suit, carrying a black legal folder. Beside her stood a credit enforcement specialist from Carter Grid Capital and a court filings courier holding a sealed packet. Elaine looked at Julian first, then at the chain lock on the future lab door, then at Preston. Her expression did not change. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "my name is Elaine Brooks. I represent Carter Grid Capital Holdings, current note holder of the commercial debt secured by Whitmore Exchange Building." Preston's mouth opened. Elaine continued, "We are now placing you on formal notice of an enforcement event." Julian looked through the glass one more time at the banner inside the locked room. "Everyone belongs in the room where they can build." Then he turned back to Preston. "You locked the wrong door." Julian Carter said it quietly, but the hallway on the 18th floor seemed to carry the words all the way back down to the lobby. Preston Whitmore stood beside the chain glass door of Carter Grid Future Lab, staring at Elaine Brooks as if her title had insulted him more than Julian ever could. Current note holder, commercial debt, enforcement event. The words did not belong in the story Preston had been telling himself that morning. In his story, he was the landlord. Julian was the man with the computer crate. Maya was the employee who needed to learn her place. Samuel was the guard paid to press buttons and stay quiet. But stories collapse when documents arrive. Elaine opened the black legal folder and removed a packet with blue tabs. "Mr. Whitmore, this notice is being delivered to you as owner representative and borrower contact for Whitmore Exchange Building Holdings." Preston took half a step back. "I am not accepting anything in a hallway." Elaine held the packet out. "Refusal to take physical possession will be noted. Service by email and courier has also been initiated." Preston looked toward the courier. The courier lifted a sealed envelope without expression. Maya Ellis stared at the packet. Samuel Reed stared at the chain lock. Julian stared through the glass at the room he had leased for students who had not yet arrived, at the computers stacked in boxes, at the banner still rolled against the wall. Everyone belongs in the room where they can build. Preston followed his eyes and scoffed. This is exactly what I mean. You are turning premium commercial property into some kind of social experiment. Julian looked at him. No, I am turning leased space into what the lease allows. Preston pointed at Elaine. And you are using some paper trick because I would not let you drag equipment through my lobby. Elaine spoke before Julian could. This is not a paper trick. The maturity default predates today. The forbearance breach predates today. The rent roll discrepancy predates today. The deferred maintenance issue predates today. Your conduct this morning did not create the debt problem. It removed the last argument that you should remain in operational control while the debt problem is handled. Preston flushed. You people have no idea how commercial buildings work. The phrase landed. You people. Again. Maya looked at Julian. Samuel did too. Elaine did not flinch. She simply said, "Please repeat that if you want it in the enforcement record." Preston, mouth closed. For once, legal precision did what outrage could not. It made him hear himself. Julian stepped toward the chain lock and touched it with one finger. When was this installed? Preston said, for security. When? Preston did not answer. Maya opened the maintenance app on her phone. There is no work order. Preston turned. Maya, stop. She looked at him, fear still in her face, but no longer in charge of her hands. There is no work order, she repeated. No tenant default notice. No access violation report. No emergency safety note. Elaine looked at her. Please preserve that screen. Maya took a screenshot. Preston snapped. I said stop. Julian looked at him. That is the second time you have tried to stop an employee from preserving a record. Preston stepped close. This is my building. Julian said, you keep saying that like ownership is permission to violate every agreement that lets the building operate. The elevator chimed again. The doors opened on a young woman carrying a box of folders and 2 folding banners. Nina Thompson stepped out, followed by 2 volunteers holding bags of power strips and notebooks. She was early by several hours because she knew community programs only worked when someone arrived before the official start and checked whether every chair, every sign-in sheet, and every student name tag was ready. She stopped when she saw the chain across the door. Julian. He turned. Nina's eyes moved from Julian to Preston to Elaine to Maya and Samuel. What happened? Preston answered before Julian could. Access issue. This floor is closed. Nina looked through the glass at the boxes. Those are our materials. Preston said, they are not going anywhere until this is resolved. Nina's face hardened. We have students coming at 2. Then postpone them. Julian said, no. Preston laughed. No. You like that word. Nina stepped closer. We have a mother coming after a night shift. We have a former warehouse supervisor taking 2 buses. We have a student who borrowed train fare to get here. You locked the room with their computers inside. Preston looked her up and down. This is not a shelter. The words were softer than the first insult, but somehow colder. Nina went still. Maya looked sick. Samuel jaw tightened. Julian took 1 step forward. Say that again. Preston realized too late that the hallway had witnesses now. He shifted tone. I mean, this building is not designed for foot traffic from unverified participants. Nina said, they are students. Preston said, they are strangers to my building. Julian answered, so was every tenant on the first day. Elaine looked at Nina. Ms. Thompson, please remain available as a witness. Your organization has a signed program agreement with Carter Grid Future Lab. Nina nodded slowly. Preston said, witness to what? She just arrived. Elaine said, to the fact that the unlawful lockout is interfering not only with a tenant, but with a scheduled program and property access tied to leased premises. Preston shook his head.
You are all overplaying this. Fine. I will open the door if that ends the performance. He reached into his pocket for keys.
Julian stopped him with one word. No. Preston froze. Julian said, "You do not get to unlock the door now and pretend the violation never happened." Preston laughed in disbelief. "You wanted access. I wanted lawful access. What I received was a discriminatory lockout, disabled credentials, a secondary chain, held property, and instructions to create false justification after the fact." Elaine added, "And all of it occurred while the borrower was already in default under a commercial debt instrument now held by my client." Preston's eyes flicked back to her. "I never agreed to any transfer." "You did not need to agree. The note was assigned. Notice was sent last week. I did not receive it." Elaine opened a tabbed page. Notice of assignment sent by certified mail, overnight courier, and email to the address listed in the loan documents. Delivery scan timestamp Tuesday at 9:36 in the morning. Email subject line: Notice of assignment and enforcement reservation for loan, WEB 1792. Maya whispered, "I saw that." Preston turned. "What?" Maya swallowed. "It came into the main office inbox. I flagged it." Preston's voice lowered. "And? You told me it was another bank letter." Preston stared at her. The silence said enough. Elaine continued. "The loan file shows payment default, covenant breach, and expired cure period. Carter Grid Capital initially held enforcement while evaluating a consensual management plan. This morning conduct has changed that posture." Preston said, "Because I delayed one tenant?" Julian answered, "Because you proved you cannot be trusted with tenants, records, access systems, or collateral protection." Preston turned toward Samuel. "Go downstairs and make sure no one from his program gets past the lobby." Samuel did not move. Preston's face darkened. "Samuel?" The older guard stood straight. "I cannot block approved visitors without written instruction under the access policy." Preston hissed, "I am giving you instruction." Samuel looked at Julian, then at Maya, then at Nina, then at the chain lock. "No, sir." It was quiet, but it rang. Preston stared at him as if Samuel had broken some ancient rule of the building. "What did you say?" Samuel's voice shook, but he did not retreat. "No, sir, I will not block visitors by a verbal order after what happened here." Preston stepped toward him. "You want to lose your job over this." Elaine spoke. "That threat is noted as potential retaliation against a witness." Preston spun toward her. "Everything is a threat to you." "No," Elaine said. "Only threats are." Nina looked at Samuel with respect. Maya looked close to tears. Julian looked at Samuel and nodded once. Not dramatic, enough. Preston saw the nod and hated it, because respect was moving through the hallway without his permission. He turned and strode into the elevator. "We are going to the conference room. I am not doing this in front of staff and whatever this crowd is." Nina said, "This crowd is why the room exists." Preston ignored her. Elaine looked at Julian. "Conference room." Julian nodded, "But the chain stays photographed and untouched until documented." Maya said, "I will make sure no one removes it." Preston snapped from the elevator, "Maya." She looked at him. "I am preserving building records." The elevator ride down felt longer than the climb. Preston stood at the front, breathing hard. Julian stood behind him, still holding the handle of the rolling crate. Elaine stood beside Julian with the legal folder closed now. Maya held the lease file. Samuel had come because he was a witness. Nina came because the locked room belonged not only to a company, but to the people arriving later with hope in their bags. The conference room on the second floor had dark paneling, a long scratch table, and a wall of framed photographs showing the Whitmore family in earlier decades. Men in suits, groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings. A picture of Preston as a child beside his father near the front doors. Preston always liked sitting under that photograph. This time, it did not help. Elaine placed the enforcement packet at the center of the table. "This meeting is being documented." Preston said, "I do not consent to a hostile takeover meeting." Elaine answered, "This is not a takeover meeting. It is a notice meeting regarding existing loan default and immediate operational risk." Julian remained standing. He did not want the head chair. That was Preston's seat. Let Preston sit under his father's picture, while losing the thing his father left him. Preston sat hard. "You are not foreclosing a building in 3 hours. I know enough to know that." Julian nodded. "Correct." Preston looked momentarily victorious. Julian continued, "A foreclosure sale does not complete in 3 hours. Ownership does not transfer by magic. The legal process continues through the required steps, but operational control, cash direction, receiver request, tenant payment instructions, access restrictions, and enforcement notices can begin today because the file was already prepared." Preston's face changed. Elaine opened the first tab. At 9:19 this morning, enhanced notice of default was transmitted to borrower counsel and property trust contacts. Preston blinked. At 9:31, the cash management trigger notice was sent under Section 6.8 of the loan agreement. She opened another page. At 9:46, tenant direction letters were prepared instructing tenants to pay rent into the controlled account pending receiver appointment or further lender direction. Another page. At 9:52, an emergency receiver application package was finalized for filing based on existing default, collateral risk, and today access interference event. Preston pushed back from the table. "You started this while I was upstairs." Elaine said, "The default started months ago." Julian said, "Today you gave them a face." Preston pointed at him. "This is retaliation." Julian finally sat. "No, retaliation would be me trying to humiliate you because you humiliated me. This is enforcement. It is slower, cleaner, and much harder for you to dismiss." Preston leaned forward. "You planned this." "I prepared for it." "Same thing." "No, planning means wanting it. Preparing means refusing to be helpless if you choose wrong." Maya lowered her eyes. Those words found her too. Preston looked at the file. "I want my attorney." Elaine nodded. "Call them. Meanwhile, preservation obligations remain active." Preston reached for his phone and dialed. While it rang, he muttered, "This is a shakedown." Julian looked at the framed photograph of Preston's father. "Did your father build this place?" Preston's eyes narrowed. "My grandfather bought it. My father expanded it." Julian nodded. "Then it survived 3 generations before you turned the door into a weapon." Preston lowered the phone. "Do not speak about my family." Julian's voice stayed calm. "My father worked in buildings like this. Men like your father walked past him every day. Some were decent, some were not. But he taught me that a building is only as honorable as the way it treats people without corner offices." Preston said, "Spare me the speech." Julian looked at him. "It is not a speech. It is why I noticed what your loan reports missed." Elaine opened another tab. "Maya Ellis, we need the access records." Maya placed her phone on the table and sent the screenshot to Elaine email. The image appeared on the conference room screen. Card suspended. Julian Carter. Carter Grid Future Lab. Reason field blank. Timestamp 8:17 in the morning. Elaine said, "Miss Ellis, did you advise Mr. Whitmore that lockout without legal notice was improper?" Maya looked at Preston. His stare was sharp enough to cut. She turned back to Elaine. "Yes." Preston muttered, "She is not a lawyer." Elaine asked, "Did he instruct anyone to create a reason after the access was suspended?" Maya's voice almost failed. "Yes." The room went still. Elaine said, "What did he say?" Maya swallowed. "He told Samuel to add, tenant attempted unauthorized move-in with unapproved equipment and disruptive conduct." Preston said, "That is not what I meant." Samuel spoke. "That is what you said." Preston turned. Samuel continued, "I was at the desk." Elaine looked at him. "Mr. Reed, did Mr. Carter cause disruption before the card was suspended?" "No." "Did he threaten anyone?" No. Did he present a lease? Yes. Did Mr. Whitmore make the statement, "People like you do not belong in my building"? Samuel closed his eyes briefly. Yes. The conference room seemed to tilt around Preston. He looked at Samuel with pure fury. "You are making a mistake." Samuel nodded slowly. "Maybe, but it is not the first one I made here." Julian watched him. Samuel continued. "The first one was believing silence kept me clean." Nina looked away, wiping at one eye. Maya did not hide her tears this time. Preston stood. "Enough." Elaine said, "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." He laughed. "You do not tell me to sit in my own building." Julian looked at him. "That sentence has become a habit you cannot afford." Preston stayed standing. At that moment, his attorney called back. Preston put the phone on speaker. A rushed voice filled the room. "Preston, I just received a default notice from Carter Grid Capital. Tell me you did not interfere with a paying tenant today." Preston froze. No one spoke. The attorney voice sharpened. "Preston!" Elaine looked at Julian. Julian looked at the locked conference room door, then back at Preston. The silence answered. The attorney exhaled. "Do not say another word until I arrive." Elaine said, "Counsel, this is Elaine Brooks for Carter Grid Capital. We are preserving all rights and moving forward with enforcement filings."
Your client should not alter records, contact witnesses, remove collateral-related documents, interfere with tenants, or issue further access instructions. The attorney said, "Understood." Preston snapped, "Do not say understood to her." The attorney replied, "Preston, be quiet." That did it. The room changed. Not because the lawyer had authority over the building, because the first person Preston expected to rescue him had chosen the file over pride. Elaine closed the first folder and opened the second. "This is the receiver package." Preston stared at the pages. Julian said, "You are about to learn something my father knew his whole life." Preston said nothing. Julian continued, "A key is not the same as control." Outside the conference room, the lobby had begun to fill. 2 tenants had come down after receiving building alerts. A maintenance worker stood near the desk, whispering with the receptionist. The Future Lab volunteers waited beside their boxes, and near the brass elevators, the men in suits who had laughed earlier no longer looked amused. They looked worried. Because money recognizes falling power before pride does. Elaine looked at the clock. 10:58. She placed one final page in front of Preston. At 11:16, if you have not voluntarily restored access, released tenant property, preserved records, and accepted interim cash controls, Carter Grid Capital will proceed with emergency filing and tenant direction notices without your cooperation. Preston stared at the time. 11:16. Julian looked at him. 3 hours after you threw my access card on the desk. Preston finally understood that the clock had been running since the plastic hit the counter. His hand shook once. Then he hid it under the table. Julian saw. So did Maya. So did Samuel. For the first time that morning, Preston Whitmore looked at the door of his own conference room as if he might be the one locked inside. The clock on the wall read 10:58. 18 minutes remained. Preston sat beneath the framed photograph of his father, cutting a ribbon outside Whitmore Exchange Building in 1986. In that picture, the building looked new, proud, and untouchable. His father had one hand on a pair of ceremonial scissors and the other on Preston's shoulder. The boy in the photograph was smiling, like inheritance was the same thing as destiny. Now the grown man beneath that picture had both hands flat on the conference table, trying to hide the tremor in his fingers. Elaine Brooks placed the receiver package in front of him. Julian Carter sat across the table, silent enough to make Preston hate him more. Maya Ellis stood near the screen, still holding the lease file. Samuel Reed stood by the door, not guarding Preston anymore, only witnessing him.
Nina Thompson waited beside the wall with her volunteer badge clipped to her coat and worry in her eyes, because students were still coming at 2. Preston looked at Elaine. "You cannot do this." Elaine answered, "We are already doing it. My attorney told me not to speak. That may be the first useful advice you followed today." Preston glared at her. Elaine did not blink. She opened the first tab and turned the document toward him. Loan WEB 1792. Original borrower, Whitmore Exchange Building Holdings. Current note holder, Carter Grid Capital Holdings. Authorized representative, Julian Carter. Preston stared at the last name. Carter. For a moment, confusion crossed his face before fear could cover it. Julian saw the exact second Preston finally connected the Future Lab lease, the note assignment, the man in work boots, and the legal folder. Preston whispered, "You bought my debt?" Julian said, "My affiliate acquired the note. Why? Because this building matters." Preston laughed once, without humor. "To you, to tenants who cannot afford your games, to people who need a room near transit, to the students arriving today, to staff you threaten when they tell the truth, to every small business you charged fees while hiding the condition of the building." Preston leaned back. So this was never about rent. Julian shook his head. It was always about access. Rent was only the paper that proved the door should open. Elaine moved to the next tab. As of last week, the borrower remained in payment default. The cure period under the previous forbearance agreement had expired. Deferred maintenance reserves were below required level. The debt service coverage ratio remained under covenant. Occupancy reports submitted by management contain inconsistencies. Preston snapped. Every building has paperwork issues. Elaine looked at him. Not every borrower locks out a lawful tenant, disables access, holds tenant property, orders staff to create a false reason, and makes discriminatory statements in front of witnesses during an active default period. The room went still. Preston looked toward Samuel. Samuel did not look away this time. Elaine continued. Your conduct this morning materially increased operational risk to the collateral. It also supports the noteholder position that existing management cannot protect tenant rights, income stream, records, or property value. Preston said, "This is one morning." Maya spoke before fear could take her voice again. "It is not." Preston turned toward her. Maya looked at Elaine, then at Julian. "There are tenant complaints, fee disputes, maintenance delays, elevator outage records changed after tenants asked for credits, fire door repairs postponed twice, rent checks held before being entered into the system. I have copies of some emails." Preston stood. "You copied internal records." Maya flinched but did not step back. "I preserved records after you told us to create a false violation." Elaine wrote something down. Preston looked at Samuel. "And you? I suppose you have a notebook too." Samuel slowly reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and removed a small black notebook held together with a rubber band. Preston's face changed. Samuel said, "I started it when you told me to deny elevator access to Mr. Iqbal from the 7th floor because his clients looked like street traffic." Nina closed her eyes. Julian looked at Samuel's notebook. "There are records people keep because the official ones are not safe." Samuel placed the notebook on the table. "Dates, times, names, instructions. Not all of them. Enough." Preston stared at it as if the notebook had betrayed him. But it had only remembered. Elaine looked at the clock. 11:06. 10 minutes. She opened a laptop and connected it to the conference screen. One by one, documents appeared. Notice of default. Notice of cash management trigger. Borrower preservation demand. Tenant direction letter. Emergency receiver application. Operations access control notice. Preston's voice dropped. "You prepared all of this before today."
Elaine answered. Yes. Then you were coming for my building anyway, Julian said. We were coming to require discipline before the building collapsed. You chose to prove discipline would not be enough. Preston stood and walked to the window overlooking Walnut Street. Below, people moved between coffee shops, buses, and office doors. He had watched that street for years and believed everyone entering his building was entering his name. He turned back. Do you know what my father survived to keep this building? Julian answered. I know what my father survived inside buildings like this. Preston's jaw tightened. That is not the same. No, Julian said. Your father left you keys. Mine left me a warning. Preston said nothing. Julian continued. He told me some men think owning a building means owning the dignity of everyone inside it. You proved him right before breakfast. Maya lowered her head. Samuel's thumb rested on the cover of his notebook. Preston looked at Nina. And this is all for your little training program. Nina lifted her chin. It is for people who were told the room was not for them before anyone saw what they could build. Preston said, Sentiment does not pay debt. Julian answered, Neither does pride. Elaine's phone buzzed on the table. She read the message. Receiver counsel is ready to file. Preston went still. At the same time, the conference room phone rang. Maya looked at the display. Borrower counsel. Elaine nodded for her to answer. Maya pressed speaker. Preston's attorney voice came through, breathless. Preston, I have reviewed the notices. Do not interfere further. Do not move money. Do not delete records. Restore tenant access immediately. Preston snapped. They are forcing this. The attorney said, Your loan file is already in default. The lockout made it worse. If they file for a receiver with witness statements and access logs, the court is likely to take it seriously. Preston gripped the back of a chair. Likely. The attorney continued, You need to cooperate enough to avoid a worse order. Preston stared at Julian. He wanted someone to say the old world still worked, that his name still outweighed documents, that the security guard words did not matter, that Maya screenshots did not matter, that the man he insulted could still be reduced to the boots on his feet. No one said it. Elaine looked at the clock, 11:13. Julian spoke quietly. Unlock the 18th floor. Preston looked almost relieved. So this is what you wanted? No. Julian pointed to the documents. I wanted it unlocked at 8:16 because the lease required it. Now unlocking it is only one condition in a much larger problem. Preston swallowed. What else? Elaine answered. Immediate access restoration for Carter Grid Future Lab. Release of all tenant property. Preservation of all records. Acceptance of cash management controls. No direct tenant rent collection. No unilateral access changes. No staff retaliation. Cooperation with temporary receiver procedures. Delivery of building bank records, maintenance contracts, tenant ledgers, inspection reports, and security logs. Preston shook his head. That is surrender. Julian said, It is what happens when a man mistakes keys for immunity. 11:15. The minute before enforcement moved felt longer than the 3 hours that had brought them there. Preston looked at the photograph of his father again. Then he looked at Maya. Remove the chain. Maya did not move. Elaine said, Be precise, Mr. Whitmore. Preston clenched his jaw. Restore access to the 18th floor for Carter Grid Future Lab and remove the unauthorized secondary lock. Maya turned to Samuel. Samuel nodded. Together, they left the room. Preston watched them go and seemed to understand that his order no longer moved through fear. It now moved through witnesses, records, and conditions. Elaine typed a note. At 11:16, borrower representative verbally agreed to access restoration. Enforcement continues. Preston sat down. I agreed. Stop the filing. Elaine looked at Julian. Julian shook his head. No. Preston stared. I opened the floor. You opened the floor after a discriminatory lockout, after holding property, after trying to create a false reason, after threatening staff, and after ignoring loan assignment notice. That is not cure. That is evidence you only comply when control is already leaving. Elaine sent a message. Filing authorized. Preston slammed his hand on the table. You cannot. The conference room door opened before Elaine could answer. Maya returned first. Her face was pale, but changed. Samuel came behind her, carrying the chain lock in both hands. It hung from his palms like a dead snake. The 18th floor is open, Maya said. All equipment appears untouched. Nina exhaled so sharply, it sounded like a sob. Julian closed his eyes for half a second. Not for victory, for the students. Maya placed the chain lock on the conference table. The metal struck wood with a dull sound. Preston stared at it. That sound was the door closing on his old authority. Elaine turned the laptop toward him. At 11:22, tenant direction letters went out to all active tenants. On the screen, the subject line appeared. Rent payment direction and building operations notice. The letter instructed tenants of Whitmore Exchange Building to direct rent payments into a controlled account under the loan documents, pending receiver proceedings or further notice. It stated that no tenant should comply with unauthorized lockout orders, side fee demands, or access changes not confirmed by the new operations contact. Preston whispered, "You told my tenants."
Elaine said, "They are income stream collateral. They also have rights."
Another message arrived. Cash management account activated. A third. Emergency receiver package filed. A fourth. Operations access administrator confirmed. Preston looked at Julian. "You froze my accounts." Elaine corrected him. "Operating cash flow is redirected according to the control agreement. You signed the loan documents that allowed this if triggers occurred." Preston said, "I signed a lot of documents." Julian said, "That was the problem. You signed them like paper did not remember." The receptionist knocked on the door. Maya opened it. "There are tenants in the lobby asking about the notice." Preston stood. "I will speak to them." Elaine said, "No." Preston looked at her. "You do not control my voice." Julian stood. "No one is stopping you from speaking. But you no longer issue building operations instructions without the receiver team or noteholder council present." Preston looked at the door. For the first time in his life, the building beyond it felt less like his and more like a place full of people he had underestimated. They moved to the lobby. The marble floor still shone. The brass elevators still reflected everyone in thin golden shapes. But the room had changed. Tenants gathered near the directory, reading the notice on their phones. A maintenance worker stood beside the reception desk. 2 Future Lab volunteers waited beside boxes of notebooks. Nina went to them and whispered that the room would open. At the front desk, a new building operations representative had arrived. A woman named Grace Holloway from Northbridge Asset Services. She carried no dramatic expression, only a binder, a temporary access tablet, and the calm of someone who had taken over troubled buildings before. Elaine introduced her. "Interim Operations Coordinator, pending receiver appointment." Preston said, "I did not approve this." Grace looked at him. "I was not sent by you." The line landed harder than she intended, or maybe exactly as hard as necessary. Grace turned to Maya. "Miss Ellis, I understand you know the tenant files and access system?" Maya hesitated. "Yes." "We will need your help stabilizing operations. No retaliation will be tolerated." Maya looked at Preston, then back at Grace. I can help. Grace turned to Samuel. Mr. Reed, access control will operate under written protocol only. No verbal lockout orders, no blocking visitors based on appearance, no secondary locks without documented authorization. Samuel nodded. Understood. Preston looked around, searching for someone still waiting for his command. No one did. Tenants began asking questions. What happens to our rent? Will our office access change? Is the building closing? What about maintenance requests? Grace answered each one with careful precision. Rent direction notices had instructions. Access remained valid. Maintenance would be triaged. Safety issues would be reviewed. No legal tenant would be locked out based on a verbal order. A small business owner from the 9th floor stepped forward. Does this mean the late fee dispute can be reviewed? Grace said, submit the record today. Another tenant asked about the elevator repairs. Grace said, they are already being pulled into the maintenance audit. Preston muttered, this is chaos. Julian looked at the lobby. No, this is what it sounds like when people stop being afraid to ask questions. Then Samuel handed Julian a new access card. Temporary credentials restored. 18th floor, full tenant access. Julian took the card. For a second, he remembered the old plastic card Preston had thrown onto the reception desk. Same shape, same size, different meaning. The first card had been used to humiliate him. This one opened the room. Nina touched Julian's arm. The students. He nodded. Let them come. At 11:41, the brass elevator carried Julian, Nina, Maya, Samuel, and Grace to the 18th floor. Preston stayed in the lobby with Elaine and his attorney on the phone, watching the elevator doors close without him inside. That was the moment the building truly shifted. Not when documents were filed, not when accounts were redirected. When Preston realized the doors could move without his permission. On the 18th floor, Maya unlocked the glass entry and removed the last temporary access warning from the keypad. Samuel held the door open. Julian stood at the threshold. Inside, the tables waited. The laptops waited. The whiteboard waited. The rolled banner waited. Nina looked at him. Do you want to go in first? Julian looked down the hall, then back at the open door. No. He stepped aside. Students first at 2. Nina smiled through tears. Maya looked at the floor. I am sorry, Mr. Carter. Julian turned to her. For what you did, or for what you allowed? The question was gentle, but it reached deep. Maya swallowed. Both. Julian nodded. Then help make sure no one else gets locked out after you know they belong. She nodded. I will. Samuel looked at the open room. I should have refused downstairs. Julian said, You refused upstairs. Late, Samuel said, but real. The older man's eyes shone. Sometimes late is all a person has left to give. Julian said, Then give it fully. At 12:03, Grace received confirmation that the receiver application had been accepted for emergency review. A hearing would be scheduled. Interim cash controls were active. Tenant notices were delivered. Building record preservation was in effect. Preston had not lost ownership in 3 hours. But he had lost the thing he valued more: command. He could not lock doors. He could not move rents. He could not erase access logs. He could not punish Maya or Samuel without creating a retaliation record. He could not collect side fees. He could not call Future Lab trespass. He could not stand in the lobby and pretend his name on the stone meant the law had to bow. At 12:18, Julian returned to the lobby. Preston was still there, but smaller somehow, even though nothing about his body had changed. He approached Julian slowly.
Mr. Carter? Julian stopped. Preston's voice lowered. If I had known who you were, I would have handled it differently. Julian looked at him for a long moment. The lobby went quiet again. Maya stood near the desk, Samuel near the elevator, Nina near the Future Lab boxes, tenants near the directory. Everyone heard Julian answer, "That is exactly why you lost control." Preston's face tightened. Julian continued, "You should not need to know a man owns your debt before you honor his lease. You should not need to know his company before you say his name. You should not need to know his power before you protect his dignity." Preston had no answer. Julian stepped past him toward the front desk. The old chandelier hummed above them. The marble floor reflected both men. One had inherited the building, the other had opened its locked door. And by the time the clock reached 1:16, 3 hours after Preston threw the access card onto the desk, every tenant in Whitmore Exchange Building had received notice that the man who claimed to decide who belonged no longer controlled the doors alone. By 1:16 that afternoon, 3 hours after Preston Whitmore threw Julian Carter access card onto the reception desk, every tenant in Whitmore Exchange Building had received the notice. Rent was no longer to be paid directly to Preston. Access decisions were no longer controlled by Preston alone. No tenant could be locked out by verbal order. No property could be held behind a door because a landlord decided someone did not look like they belonged. The words on the notice were quiet, but the building heard them. In the lobby, Preston stood beneath the brass directory with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to his attorney explain what he had already begun to understand. Commercial foreclosure would not finish in a single afternoon. A court would still review filings. A receiver would still need authority. The process had steps, documents, hearings, notices, rights. But operational control was already slipping. Cash controls were active. Tenant direction letters had gone out. The emergency receiver package had been filed. Building records were under preservation demand. The access system had been transferred to interim operations, and the man Preston had tried to humiliate was standing 10 feet away, watching students enter the lobby with notebooks in their hands. That was the part Preston could not bear. Julian did not look triumphant. He looked focused. At 2:02, the first Carter Grid Future Lab students arrived. A mother named Denise Carter stepped through the front doors, still wearing her hospital cafeteria shoes after a night shift. She had a borrowed laptop bag over one shoulder and a paper notebook pressed against her chest. A former warehouse supervisor named Marlon Price followed her, looking up at the chandelier like he expected someone to ask why he was there. A 19-year-old student named Jalen Brooks came next, carrying a cracked tablet and an envelope with his train receipts inside, because Nina Thompson had promised reimbursement. They stopped at the security desk. Samuel Reed stood straighter than he had all morning. "Good afternoon," he said. "Welcome to Carter Grid Future Lab, floor 18. Denise blinked, as if welcome was not the word she had prepared herself to hear. Marlon asked, "Are we in the right place?" Samuel looked at Julian, then back at the students. "Yes, sir, you are exactly in the right place." Those words crossed the lobby more powerfully than any legal notice. Maya Ellis watched from behind the reception desk. Her eyes filled, but she did not wipe them. She wanted to feel the shame. She wanted it to teach her. For 2 years, she had told herself Preston was just difficult, just old-fashioned, just protective of the building image. She had softened his words in her own mind because the truth had seemed too expensive. Now she understood the cost of that softness. A locked door, a false record, a room of students almost turned away before the room could change their lives. Nina Thompson walked beside the students, smiling like someone trying not to cry. When the elevator doors opened, Julian stepped aside. "After you," he said. Denise looked at him. "Are you not coming?" "I am."
Then why are you waiting? Julian looked toward Preston across the lobby. Because today, the first people through that door should be the people it was built for. The students entered. Samuel held the elevator. Maya followed with the access tablet. Nina carried the sign in sheets. Julian entered last. The brass doors closed. Preston remained in the lobby. For years he had controlled who went up. Now the elevator rose without asking him anything. On the 18th floor, the glass doors stood open. The chain lock was gone. The computers were still inside. The banner had been unrolled across the front wall. Carter Grid Future Lab. Everyone belongs in the room where they can build. Denise read it once, then again. Marlon set down his bag slowly, as if the room might vanish if he moved too fast. Jalen touched the edge of one of the refurbished laptops. Nina spoke to the group. This morning almost did not happen, but it did, and I want you to remember that. Some doors close because people are afraid of who you might become once you enter. Do not let that make you smaller. Julian stood near the back of the room, beside a box of network cables. He had planned to stay silent. Then Denise raised her hand.
Mr. Carter, is it true you built this company after fixing servers? Julian smiled slightly. Yes. So you started like us. He looked down at his work boots. I started with less confidence than some of you have already shown by walking in today. The room softened. Julian continued. My father worked maintenance in buildings like this. He told me some people think owning a building means owning the dignity of everyone inside it. He was wrong about one thing. The students listened. He said some people think that. Today I learned, some people still act on it. So our job is not only to enter rooms, our job is to change what happens inside them. Nina nodded. Maya looked toward the floor. Samuel stood by the door, hands folded, tears bright in his eyes. At 3:30 that afternoon, Grace Holloway from Northbridge Asset Services took temporary control of building operations pending the receiver hearing. She set up a table in the second-floor conference room and began collecting documents.
Maintenance logs, tenant ledgers, access change records, vendor contracts, inspection reports, fee schedules, bank deposit records. Preston had once used that conference room to intimidate staff. Now it became the room where his choices were cataloged. The audit began that same evening. By the next morning, the building had started speaking. The air and heating system repair fund had been drained for unrelated expenses. Elevator service had been delayed, while tenants were still billed a full maintenance recovery fee. 2 small business tenants had paid extra access fees that were not in their leases. One immigrant-owned accounting firm had been threatened with lockout after disputing a cleaning charge. A Black-owned design studio on the 7th floor had been asked for additional insurance documents after a white-owned firm with the same lease type was not. Complaint notes had been rewritten. Emails had been deleted from active folders but preserved in backup. Maintenance photos showed fire door problems older than the reports claimed. Samuel Notebook confirmed patterns that official logs did not. Maya emails filled in dates. The access record from Julian card tied everything to the morning of the lockout. Preston called it a misunderstanding until his own documents stopped letting him. At the receiver hearing the following week, Elaine Brooks did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She showed the loan default. She showed the expired cure period. She showed the cash control trigger. She showed the access lockout. She showed the instruction to create a false reason after the fact. She showed witness statements from Maya and Samuel. Preston attorney tried to argue that the landlord had acted to protect the building. The judge looked over the file and asked one question. Protected from what? The courtroom went silent. Preston did not answer. Because the honest answer was not theft. It was not damage. It was not danger. It was people. People he thought lowered the image of a lobby built by his family. The court appointed a receiver to manage the building during the foreclosure process. Preston remained the legal owner while proceedings continued, but his practical control was stripped away. He could no longer direct rent, approve lockouts, control maintenance funds, alter access records, or silence staff. The building still carried his name outside, but inside, the doors no longer obeyed him. That was the reckoning. Not a dramatic fall down marble stairs, not a shouted confession. A slow removal of every lever he had used to make other people feel small. Maya was offered a position under the receiver team because she knew the building and had preserved records. She almost refused. She said she did not deserve to stay after staying silent for so long. Julian met her in the lobby at 7:41 one morning while contractors repaired the west elevator. "You think leaving will make it clean?" he said.
Maya looked down.
"Maybe. It will not." She swallowed. "Then what should I do? Tell the truth when it costs you something, then build a system where the next person does not have to pay as much to tell it." Maya took the job. Her first new rule was simple: no tenant access change without written basis, legal review, and dual approval. Her second rule was even simpler. Security staff could refuse any order that violated access policy without fear of retaliation. Samuel read that rule twice. Then he folded the paper and put it inside his jacket pocket beside his old notebook. 3 months later, the foreclosure process had not become a miracle. It had become something better. A record. Preston was removed from management permanently under the receiver order. Several fees were refunded to tenants. The maintenance accounts were separated. Fire safety repairs were completed. Elevator service was placed under direct contract oversight. Tenant complaints were reviewed by an independent administrator. The building began the process of transferring long-term control to the noteholder and new investment partners. The old name still remained on the stone for a while: Whitmore Exchange Building. But tenants had already stopped saying it with respect. They called it the Exchange now. Because something had been exchanged. Fear for process, silence for record, locked doors for lawful access. One evening, Julian returned to the 18th floor after the final Future Lab class of the first term. The room was messy in the best way. Empty coffee cups, whiteboards covered in code, interview practice notes taped to the wall, a server rack humming softly in the corner, a stack of repaired laptops ready for the next group. Denise had passed her first data certification exam. Marlon had been offered a junior operations analyst interview. Jalen had built a small scheduling application for the program. Nina stood by the window looking over the city lights. "You should be proud," she said. Julian looked at the rows of desks. "I am grateful. That is not the same." "No." He touched the small key in his pocket. It was not a building key. It was one of his father's old maintenance keys, worn smooth and no longer opening anything. Julian had carried it since Frank died, not because it unlocked a door, but because it reminded him who had been forced to use side entrances so his son could learn to walk through front ones. Nina noticed it. "Your father?" Julian nodded. He spent his life fixing buildings other men claimed as theirs. "And you took one back." Julian shook his head. "No, we opened one." Downstairs, Maya was closing out the daily access report. Samuel stood beside the desk, helping a tenant from the 9th floor reset her card. Grace Holloway reviewed a maintenance schedule with a contractor. No one asked whether the tenant looked like she belonged. No one looked at clothing before checking a valid name. No one threw a card on the desk. The lobby was still old, the marble still cracked near the west column, the chandelier still hummed. But the air was different. A building changes when fear stops being the operating system. 6 months after the lockout,
The receiver approved a new name for the building under the transition plan: the Carter Exchange Lab and Offices. Julian did not ask for his name on the stone. In fact, he argued against it. But Nina told him that names can become promises if the people inside keep them honest. On the morning the new sign was unveiled, Samuel stood near the front door in a pressed blazer. Maya stood beside him, now operations director for the property. Nina stood with the first future lab graduates. Denise brought her son. Marlon brought his work boots because he said they reminded him not to be ashamed of where he started. Jalen held the laptop he had repaired himself. Preston did not attend. His attorneys were still fighting parts of the foreclosure. His family name still appeared in old photographs and public records, but the building no longer carried his voice through its halls. Julian stood at the entrance and looked up at the new sign: the Carter Exchange Lab and Offices. Below it, a smaller line read, "Access with Dignity." Nina handed him a microphone. "You should say something." Julian looked at the students, tenants, staff, and neighbors gathered in front of the doors. Then he set the microphone down. "Not much," he said. A few people laughed softly. Julian opened the front door and held it. "That is enough." One by one, people entered. Students, tenants, cleaners, engineers, lawyers, security staff, small business owners, people in suits, people in work boots, people carrying laptops, people carrying lunch bags. Nobody asked them to prove they deserved the floor beneath their feet before they crossed it. Maya watched them pass and whispered to Samuel, "I should have spoken sooner." Samuel looked at the doorway. "Me too." Then he said, "We speak now." She nodded. "We speak now." Julian heard them and did not turn around. Some sentences are better when they are not interrupted. Later that day, he went alone to the 18th floor. The first class of the new term would start at 6. The room was quiet. Sunlight fell across the desks. The old maintenance key lay in Julian's palm. He thought of his father. Frank Carter, standing in a lobby with his toolbox open. Frank Carter, walking home instead of taking the bus because anger needed space. Frank Carter, saying that a building owner did not own a person's dignity. Julian closed his hand around the key. Then he hung it inside a small frame near the Future Lab entrance. Under it, Nina had printed one sentence: "A key is not power unless it opens the door for someone else." Julian looked at the frame for a long time. Then he walked back to the classroom and turned on the lights. The room filled slowly that evening. A laid-off delivery driver, a grandmother learning basic computer systems, a teenager who had never been inside a commercial office before, a veteran who said he was nervous about being the oldest person in class. Julian greeted each of them by name, not by appearance, not by title, by name. That morning, months ago, Preston Whitmore thought he was only locking out a black man with a computer crate. He thought work boots meant weakness. He thought a simple jacket meant no power. He thought his name on the building gave him the right to decide who belonged. But he did not know Julian Carter had already read the loan file. He did not know Carter Grid Capital held the note. He did not know Maya had saved the access log. He did not know Samuel had kept the notebook. He did not know the locked door would become the final line in a foreclosure file, already waiting for the truth.
That is how arrogance falls. Not always with a crash. Sometimes with a timestamp. 8:17, card suspended, reason field, blank. Sometimes with a sentence: "People like you do not belong in my building." Sometimes with a question: "Are you sure this is still your building?" And sometimes with a door opening 3 hours later for the very people someone tried to keep outside. Remember that. A landlord may own walls, a lender may hold paper, a company may sign a lease.
but no one owns the dignity of the person standing at the door. If this story made you think of a room you were told you did not belong in, share it. If you believe access should never depend on how rich someone looks, say so in the comments. And if you want more stories where quiet dignity uses truth, law, and patience to break polished arrogance, subscribe and stay close. Because somewhere, another door is being locked by someone who thinks power is the key in their hand.
They have not yet learned what Julian Carter learned from his father.
The real power is not in locking people out. It is in opening the room wide enough for the future to walk in.